So I was looking for resin pigments on Amazon the other day when I was scrolling, and I came across some pigments that apparently glow in the dark. So I began searching for glow in the dark pigments, and there's a whole bunch of listings, different companies, different colours, and I thought to myself, that's pretty epic. I want to make something out of that. So I went over to my local wood supplier and bought probably their worst piece of wood in the shop. It's just a piece of sapele, and just look how badly twisted this was. There's a reason it was so cheap. I'll be making 4x4 inch coasters, and there'll be sets of 4, so I'm just marking the wood every 16 inches or so, plus a little bit extra. I took the wood over to my miter saw to cut them up, and I was a little bit nervous, I'm not going to lie. Whenever you're cutting wood this badly shaped, there's quite a big chance that you're going to get the blade pinch against the wood and you'll get kickback, but I just took multiple passes, making shallow cuts, and luckily I survived without getting sucker punched by the wood. So once the wood's all chopped up, you can just see, especially that top piece, just how badly out of shape it was. So I took it over to my planer, and I spent quite a lot of time here. It always surprises me how much wood you actually have to take off when you're buying rough pieces of wood, but I suppose that's the price you pay for such cheap lumber at the end of the day. All I'm doing here is I'm just making one face side of the wood flat, and then also one of these sides, and that way when I send it through the thicknesser it'll be a uniform thickness. At this point I was still being very optimistic and naive, and still thinking I could get 3 planks from each piece of wood, so I tried to do as little plane off the top as possible to try and make that happen, but you can see in a minute that I just couldn't make it work. Once I ran through both the faces and the edges of wood, then it was all ready to take over to the bandsaw. So then took it to my bandsaw, and I resawed it down into 2. Had I had a fresh bandsaw blade and my bandsaw was fully tuned up, I could probably get 3 pieces out of it, and that would have been a lot better. However, when I make my designs, and you'll see later on in the video that some of them just required you to dig quite deep into the wood but not actually go all the way through, so I didn't want to risk it, and I just thought I'll just have thicker lumber instead. I still had to come up with some designs, so I logged on, and after using my state-of-the-art designing software, I was then ready to start. The first design is going to be one that I do for pretty much all my coasters that I sell on Etsy and conventions, and all you do is you set your depth stop on your miter saw to probably around 1/2 centimetre before you'd cut all the way through. Clamp a piece of wood down between the fence and your workpiece, and that just allows the blade to cut all the way through at the same depth you've set the stop at. Once you do that, you can adjust your saw and pretty much just cut at any angle you like, really, and there's no formula to this. You can do as many cuts as you want, different angles, just be creative with it. And it just goes back to what I was saying earlier, where I needed thick enough lumber that I could do a design like this, but also have enough space for the resin where once I cut it up and plane it, then I can cut it all the way up to where that resin sits at the bottom. Then moving on to the second design, I used I believe it's called a spiral upcutting bit. I put that in my hand router, and just like the first design, I adjusted the depth so it was just shy of cutting all the way through the wood. I then took it outside and I just started free cutting it, and I'll be honest, I didn't really know what design I was going for on my head. I was kind of going for like a tribal design, but I'll be honest, I just went through this blind and I wasn't really sure what I was doing at this point. You can see there I'm doing a plunge cut, and the reason why I did that is that I can start in the middle and have a bit more uniqueness of a design. It wasn't just lines going from side to side, it started off in the middle, and you know, it just gave off a better look that way. And I also did a few circles which didn't look like circles at all, however it still gave it a bit more of a cool design to it. Now moving on to the third design, I wanted to do the buttons on a PlayStation controller, so the square, the triangle, the circle and the X. So I got a piece of plywood and I made a square and a triangle to use as like a template for the plunge router, and you'll see later in the video how that square ends up being the bane of my existence. I then grabbed my plunger router, and I'm going to be using a brass bushing for this, so I need to put my adapter plate in, which is what that silver plate is there. And this bushing comes as a set, but without that adapter, it won't fit. So if you do plan to do this yourself, just make sure that you got the right adapter for your own router. Luckily, I have some acrylic circular templates I can use, and I just put some double-sided sticky tape on the bottom of it, and then I'll stick that down to the wood as a guide for the router. I will tell you one thing now though, and that's to don't make the mistake of buying cheap double-sided sticky tape, because once that tape peels away, and it does happen very easy, your router will just start straying off, chewing up the wood as it goes, and it will definitely ruin your day. So top tip, definitely get some good strong sided sticky tape. You can see there that I'm just following the inside of that template around, and then I spray the dust into my face and then into the neighbour's garden, which I'm sure she'll love. Then I moved on to the triangle piece, so stuck that down, and just to give the router some support along the base, I've also stuck some plywood either side of it just to stop it from tipping over. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that was a lot easier than I thought it was going to be, but I definitely ended up eating my own words when I got to the square shape. Similarly again, I put some plywood around the edge just to give it a bit of support, and working around the square, and you can see here how lift the router up, and I could see that I've just come away a little bit at the bottom there, so obviously I wasn't pushing hard enough. So I tried it again, and I ended up having to use the other piece of wood for this, and did the same thing, made the plywood supports, and this time I made them the same distance from the square as the actual thickness of the bushing, so hopefully that shouldn't let any of the let that bit wander off. However, if you watch here, a slip, and then when I lift the rotor up, you can see that square is just peeled away from itself, and at this point it was just super frustrating, and I was annoyed, and I had to take a break here and just go grab a coffee. I came back, and then I tried the same thing again, and it happened again. And I remember thinking to myself how I managed to make a triangle first time, but not a simple square. So I changed it up this time. Instead of going around the square, I've made a template where I can go around the inside of the square, and that seemed to do a lot better. It's not perfect, but it's still better. I then made the X just by using a guide with a router and just cutting 2 straight lines, which is pretty simple. Much better than square anyway. Now moving on to the fourth design. This one took me so much longer than I was hoping for, and I was going for a hexagon pattern like the shape of honeycomb, and I did this by buying some small wooden hexagons off Amazon. They're only like £3 or so, and I used some regular lollipop sticks as spacers so I can get an even spacing all around them. Then after precisely cutting the sticks into pieces, I then began the long process of putting them all together. You might be wondering, well, why don't I just use an acrylic template like I did for all the other coasters? And well, the template does actually exist, but none of them are big enough, or small enough should I say, for coasters, and the ones you see online are just way too big, and they're more designed for things like desks and charcuterie boards and things like that. So unless I was to get like a custom one, I'll just have to stick to making my own for now. And then it was just a case of using my plunger router again with one of them bushings and straight cutting bits like earlier, and I just worked around following the hexagons, and to be honest I was quite surprised at how well this worked. I was half expecting half of them to break off, the glue to break, pieces just going everywhere, but it actually turned out pretty good. I just had to do a bit of cleaning up with some of the edges with a chisel, but easy work, and makes for good ASMR. Now that the designs are done, I just wrap all the edges and the bottom with parcel tape. It doesn't have to be parcel tape, I just prefer it just because it's quite flexible and it's also quite strong, and I've got loads of it. I buy in bulk packs, so it's easy to use, and Just make sure that you get all the air gaps from the sides, because if there's any place where that resin wants to go, and that is a place where you don't want it to be, so just make sure it's all sealed up, airtight, and then that will save you any hassle in the future. So I've had to go back onto the Amazon listing to see if there's any kind of ratio I can work with for the pigment to the amount of resin I use. And the listing didn't have anything on what sort of formula to work out with. So I've gone to different listings to see if they've got any kind of instructions. And let me just show you what these listings say. This one says, it's easy to use. Just let the colour pigment exposed to light source for a few minutes and wait. F. Cool. And then you go onto a different listing and then it says, note, add medium to powder, not powder to medium, just in case you're wondering. So I've gone back on the original listing and I've gone down to the reviews to see if anyone's had the same issue. And only one person I can find has given me some form of ratio. LJD has said, I use this for resin, but I didn't use enough. You need a ratio of 1:4 resin, a lovely colour and does glow well in the dark. Thank you, LJD. I'm going to use that formula. If it all goes tits up, then it is all your fault. Just kidding. But it will be your fault because I don't know what ratio to use. So I started pouring the resin. I'm using glass cast 50 if anyone was wondering. And once I got to the pigments, it just hit me how much a 4:1 ratio actually was. I think I used like half the tub and I think it ended up being about 80 grams. And one thing I noticed about the pigments, it's not like your typical mica powder. The texture was almost like a fine grit, like a 220 grit sandpaper. It's really weird, and you'll see later in the video how much of an issue that actually causes me in the end. I then stirred using my mum's favourite coffee spoon, and I started pouring. I've clamped all of the pieces together as well, and I've just done that so it squidges all of the coasters together, and I find that by doing that it stops the resin from puddling up on the sides of the tape, pushing itself away from the wood and then having a little pool party underneath. Once they're all poured, I just like to go over it again with a lighter and just pop all the bubbles. This isn't mandatory, I think it's just a guilty pleasure at this point because it's fun. You don't have to do it with thick custom resins, they usually just pop on their own during the curing process. Earlier in the video I said about how these pigments were going to become an issue, and you can see it right here, all the pigment has just sank to the bottom of the resin like sand. Even with stirring it thoroughly and even during the curing process, it's still done that, and that's going to be an issue because that's where all that glow is going to be, and that will show up in the final product. So the plan was just to send them through my thicknesser upside down and just take off more and more wood until I reach that layer where all them pigments are sat at the bottom of the resin. Turn it over, and then that was going to be the actual top of the coaster. However, I wasn't able to do this because if I was going to do it that way, then it meant the coasters are going to be too thin, and to be honest, I just had to suck it up at this point. Once all the pieces are planed, I then take it over to my miter saw and use my coaster fence. You might be wondering what makes that a coaster fence, and well, that's just what I've written on it with a Sharpie. Just kidding. Essentially, it's just a stop block, which is square on the edges, and I clamp it at 4 inches so I can make consistent 4-inch cuts. It's a simple process really. I just make a small cut on the end so I know it's square, push that up against the coaster fence, then make the next cut, and then once you've done that, you can flip the coaster around, put one of the freshly cut sides up against the main fence, take another sliver off and buff that against the coaster fence one more time to take the rest off. And then that should leave you with a 4x4 coaster, all sides freshly cut, and that will help get rid of any residue left from the sticky tape. And now I'll begin everyone's favourite part, and that is to sand and root the edges. I start off with the 120 grit and I just do a light pass all over the coasters, and that just ensures that I've got a flat and smooth surface for when I go over it with a router. I'm using a round over bit here. Don't ask me which brand it is. It's just one of them cheap ones you can get from Amazon, and I've had it years so I can't even remember what size it is. Then I excitably rounded over every corner of both sides of every coaster, and yes, I do wish I had a router table. Once that was done, I then hand sanded the sides and began sanding the top of the coaster, starting from 120 and just going up every grit until 400. If you haven't already, get yourself an air compressor, and this just is night and day. It helps blow off the dust off your coaster, the sander, and even the sanding disc itself, so it lasts longer. Also helps avoid getting any of them horrible, deep, swirly scratches you get in the epoxy. After I sand them down to 400, I then wipe them down with methylated spirit. This just helps raise the grain from the sanding process and gives that wood fibre its last bit of hope before I then sand it down to 400 again. Then give them one more wipe over with the spirits to clean them, and then we're all good to go to the finishing process. The finish I'm using is going to be an Osmo Poly X. It's an oil wax blend, and I'm rocking with the glossy finish with these. I had to have a bit of a debate as to what finish to use, because if these coasters are going to glow, then I don't want anything like a lacquer or a varnish that would give it UV protection, stopping that light from getting to the pigments. So I've opted for Osmo, and I just like it just because it's easy to use and it still gives a glossy finish. I apply one coat to the entire coaster, I wait for that to dry, then add a second coat, but this time I don't do the bottom of it. Once the coasters are dry, I then use some cork bottoms that I can put to all the bottoms of the coaster. And these are great. You can cut them to whatever size you like. They come with self-adhesive as well, so you can just peel them off and stick them straight on. Now that the coasters are finished, I just keep looking at that line where all that pigment has sunk to the bottom, and to me it just does not look good enough. But luckily I still have one spare piece of wood left, and this time I'm going to change it and see if I can do a bit better than this. For the last design, I'm going to combine two of the designs together actually, and it's going to be straight lines again, but this time it's going to be with the spiral bit and not the miter saw, and hopefully that way there'll be more resin on show that will give off a better glow. I ended up making a jig for this, and really it's just a scrap piece of wood drilled into another scrap piece of wood, but it ended up working really well. I could pivot the jig wherever I wanted to and get the angles I wanted, and I then used this as a guide to run my hand router through it, and that way I can make straight cuts. Once that was all done, I taped it all back up, and now it's time to tackle the resin again. I think what happened last time was that the pigments were actually denser than the consistency of the resin, so this time around I'm going to let the resin cure on the cup for a couple of hours before pouring, and hopefully that solves that issue. And you can see here just how thick that resin became, and not gonna lie, I was a little bit worried at this point. I was just thinking that it wouldn't stick to the wood and I just have a ton of bubbles that I wouldn't be able to get out, but fingers crossed, so far so good. After around 5 days or so, I took them out of the mould and then began planing them down, and I was getting pretty excited at this point because I didn't have any of that sunken pigment line, and it was a consistent light blue throughout, which I was hoping for, and you'll see in the final result how much better they look compared to the other designs I did. Then it was just repeating the process of cutting them into pieces, cutting the roundovers, sanding it to 400, and then finishing. So that is the end of the video. You might be wondering, why was that not included into the montage, or the glow part anyway? And that's because they look like crap in the dark. I think the issue is that not only have the pigments sank to the bottom of the resin, they're just, the whole design itself just doesn't have a lot of resin to glow anyway. So even putting my light exposure up on my phone, trying to get some footage of it glowing, I just couldn't get any. It was that bad. So I'll probably just frisbee these down the road or something, or frisbee them into a bin. I think without a doubt, this one's got to be the best design. They just glow so much better. You haven't got that horrible pigment line, and even just light from the window and the bedroom light during the day, these will glow for the majority of the night, and you'll wake up in the night thinking like you're being invaded or something. But which design do you guys prefer the most? I definitely feel the hexagon one came a strong second. I think the only thing I didn't like about it was that pigment line. It just didn't glow as much as the that design did. But I don't know. Let me know which ones would you put in your house or somewhere. If you like this video, then please consider liking and subscribing. This is my first YouTube video, and it is very awkward to ask for this, but it'll help me stay motivated and also give me ideas for what to do next, because this was the only video design idea I actually had. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next video whenever I decide to make one.